Okay, so welcome to class, and let's start with just a couple of props, just gathering some things. Get a block or two, if you use two typically. Grab yourself a strap and two yoga blankets, Mexican blankets, or just big bath or beach towels. And if you have a bolster, grab yourself a bolster. Couch pillow works, even just like a regular, nice thick bed pillow works. And if you don't want to use any of those, I can show you how to set up the same thing, a similar bolster shape, just by using your blankets or towels. So if you don't have a bolster, you want to use your blankets, here's what you're going to do. You're going to put your blanket on the floor, and just showing it from the side, this is going to be fairly easy. You just roll your blanket into a burrito or a taquito. And then you take your second blanket, right? It's like a double layer burrito, and you wrap that baby inside of the first baby or inside of the second baby, and then again make a nice thick round shape. So this can be your bolster if you don't have a regular yoga bolster. So I'm just going to put that right here, but otherwise the setup is very similar. And actually have a blanket ready to put underneath your head. And it doesn't have to be a big lift. So if you take from the shoulder stand position of the blanket and you just fold that in half, that's typically a nice pillow setup. If that seems to be too high, you can always adjust it once you get the pose going. So you grab your belt from there, grab a strap, and if you don't have a regular yoga strap, any belt works, just even any material that's around 5 to 6 feet long, as long as you can kind of loop it and tie it with a buckle. So where you're going to start is keeping your knees bent and your feet flat on the floor. Make sure the belt is just a little bit above the knees and tighten it up just so that your knees come to touch. They don't have to squeeze hard. It's probably better actually that they don't, so you don't have too much pressure here from the belt on the outside of the legs, just to prevent any possibility of circulation loss. So your legs are adducted and internally rotated with this belt. The other additional good footnote to when you set up a belt on your body, keep the buckle right in the center between the legs so that it's off of any leg hair, skin, or clothing. Okay, and then you take this bolster or your blankets again, or your couch pillow, whatever you're going to use, and you put that right underneath your knees. Good. And you can hold the back of your thighs, and I want you to try to roll back so you're attaching all the vertebrae of your spine to the floor from the lowest to the top. So as I come down, I hold on with my hands, I get my lower back to touch, then my mid back, and eventually when my shoulder blades come down, if you can tell, my head is definitely on the blanket, but so are my shoulders. So at that point, it's important to readjust yourself so that your blanket, the head blanket, anyways, is only underneath the head. Most importantly is that your blanket doesn't push on your shoulders from below, because that'll kind of recreate the same sedentary lifestyle posture of the upper body. Now, finally, with the legs and the bolster or blankets underneath them, walk your feet forward ever so carefully until your legs cannot go any further forward. Your feet cannot go any further forward because the bolster under your knees has stopped them. And if you have your block close by, place your block on its flattest, most stable side, right on your abdomen. And all people are different sizes and shapes, so I want to try to just ask that you place the block as much as you can on the softest part of your abdomen. Try to keep the block, the top edge of it, away from your ribs as much as possible, and the bottom part of it away from your pelvic bones. Now, it might touch a little bit, but generally, as much soft belly contact with the block as possible is going to be very useful. And then relax your arms at your sides, close your eyes, and just let the initial minute or 2 or 3 be really all about utter and complete comfort. And if it needs to take you a little bit of time to be comfortable closing your eyes, take all the time you need. But once your eyes do get closed, something else very curious happens And this panorama of sensation begins to open up of other sensations away from vision. And this is because on the level of neurology, your visual processing takes up a lot of bandwidth, a lot of cognitive, neurological, even physiological bandwidth. And it also takes up a pretty significant portion of your brain, depending on who's doing the estimates. It's well established that somewhere between 40 to 70% of your brain real estate is devoted to just vision alone. And so when you start to cut off, let's call it this imposition of vision, it opens up another door. And this is the door to your other sensory inputs. So what is that like right now as you lay here? How does your body actually feel on the ground? And there's a term in yoga philosophy and just really yoga practice, viveka. And the best translation for viveka is discrimination. Interchangeably used as also discernment. And discrimination in itself is not actually a bad thing. And most fundamentally, this is just discrimination between what is useful and applicable and what isn't. And so on the easiest level, when you lay here, you want to try to discriminate between whether or not the first position, the first form of your body, the first shape that you make, is actually the best and the most comfort inducing. And that leads to a more granular discrimination of exactly how does my body contact the ground. So you just kind of peer into the sensation of your heels touching the ground or your feet touching the ground. And notice if one foot, is heavier than the other. Not only that, but if one foot has a different part of it that's in contact with the ground than the other foot. And if that is the case, then readjust your feet and legs so that the same parts of the feet are contacting the ground with the exact same pressure between the left and right. Having done that, trace the same sensation, the same arithmetic up your legs, and notice how your body and your hips are composed on the ground and whether there's a difference in how the left sits versus how the right sits. Just notice how much your abdomen actually moves while you're breathing. And having the block there on top of it gives you better feedback because it's an unfamiliar object. And so it's a little bit more ready, a little bit more available to your scheme of attention. One of the most common presentations of breath dysfunction, which is actually fairly common in our society and our world, has to do with the abdomen not moving to the degree that it should when we breathe. And our abdomen has to be able to move as we inhale and exhale because it's in the same area as the lowest lobes of your lungs. And if you allow your abdomen to get better movement through breathing, then you help to oxygenate these lower lobes of the lungs, which actually constitute about 2/3 of your full respiratory volume. And that's why I think it's important to start with just 5 breaths, and even to exaggerate it in filling up your entire lung space with the precise aim of moving your abdomen. So what we're going to do is just take 5 deep breaths, and I want you to think of this as a sequence. So when you inhale, you have to make sure that your belly expands first. So you're just going to push into the block as if you're lifting it up towards the ceiling. And once your belly can expand no more, then you start to expand your ribs. But the exhale is the opposite, the exact opposite. As you breathe out in the beginning, the first 1/3 of your exhale, make sure that you contract your chest, but still keep your abdomen expanded. And the last 2/3 of your exhale, start to contract your abdomen. Make sure, though, at the very end of the exhale, you kind of get to the rock bottom of your exhale process of your lungs. Okay, so we're just going to do 5 of these. And make sure that you're moving slow. Anytime in the next 5 to 10 seconds, when you feel ready, start with a big exhale, though, of course, because that clears your lung space. And then as you inhale, start to really push your abdomen out, push your belly button into the block, fill up the lower belly first, and then the last 1/3, fill up the chest. Notice the broadening of your ribs. And when you begin your exhale, make sure that you keep your belly distended. Contract your chest first and ribs, and then finally contract your belly at the very base of the exhale. And you do this a total of 5 times, so 4 more. And the reason for this is not only does it get to highlight where you may have fallen short in this abdominal movement of good functional breathing, but it also helps to remind us, introduce us to really what the capacity of our breath is. And you can think of it this way. You can think of it, you need breath to live. And if our breath is diminished and contracted, every other function of the body is, by definition, by association, contracted too. So in order to get the most out of our physical, neurological, psychological function, the breath has to be well organized. It has to be healthy and strong, flexible also. So as you start to open up the parameters of your breath, the whole scope of your volume, respiratory volume, you're actually reigniting the function of every other system in the rest of the body. Right? And so you can almost think of it like this. It's the game of life, being alive, cannot exist outside of where you can breathe. You cannot live and function differently than your respiratory habits. So what we do here, kind of like drawing a border around a soccer field or a football field, is by expanding the breath this way, we draw a wider border around the so-called field. And so that the game of life, the game of health and well-being, has more of a horizon. It has more ability. It has a further reach. Now, when you're done with your last exhale, Stop trying to breathe actively and just notice how things feel. Notice even what default mode your breath comes back to. And notice especially if the amount that your abdomen moves now, once you stop breathing actively, how it compares to the way that your abdomen moved before we started breathing. And even if the difference is slight, try not to associate that with this word negligible, which is used in the health, wellness, medical world. Changes and shifts that are incremental are not insignificant. And in fact, this is how our biology period, is designed or how it functions. And that changes have to take place at an organic pace, which is oftentimes a lot slower than what we actually want, what we actually desire. Okay, so keeping your eyes closed still. When you're ready, you can start to move your toes and fingers, ankles and wrists. And then you can take the block off of your belly, put that off to the side, and then walking your feet back towards the body until your feet are more flat on the floor. Start to lift your legs and hug your legs to your chest. And as soon as your thighs and knees get a little bit closer to you, begin to unwind, untie your belt. And you can take the belt off right away, put that off to the side so you can get a little bit of a deeper hug, or you can just widen the belt and hug your legs in with the belt around. But I want you to try to think of this as child's pose on your back, to where your thighs have plenty of space between them. And it's not so much that you're pulling your knees towards the chest, it's more that you're pulling your knees towards their own relative respective armpits. And as you exhale, I want you to try to pull your legs in a little bit tighter, almost as if you're aiming your thighs to the ground right next to your rib cage. But when you inhale, try not to let your thighs be pushed away just by the increase of your thoracic volume. So every exhale, see if you can hug your legs a little bit deeper, but every inhale, keep your thighs closed and at the same time try to press your tailbone to the mat. So it's really like you're flattening your butt to the floor while at the same time flattening every other junction of your spine. And because you do that on the inhale, something even more interesting and very valuable happens is you're creating more pressure in your body, so intra-abdominal pressure, intrathoracic pressure, and the increase of that pressure, because it has no place to go by letting your abdomen expand or your ribs expand. Now that pressure starts to push the opposite ends of your spine further away from one another, creating what's called axial extension, which just basically means a lengthening of your whole spinal column from top to bottom. And this lengthening is critical. This lengthening creates space. It starts to reduce pressure on the spinal discs between the vertebrae, and any other pathologies that are associated with that can really start to become a little bit more alleviated. Okay. So then you're going to bring your feet flat to the floor, move your bolster or blankets off to the side, and let's go right into a couple of nerve glides, as we usually do for these classes. So you're going to interlace your fingers right underneath your thigh, adjust your hands either close to the knee or the hip so that your elbows can be at their straightest. And maybe that doesn't mean fully locked out straight, but just as straight as possible while maintaining a vertical position of your thigh. And the vertical position of your thigh kind of takes precedent to what shape of your arms you have. But in any case, try to meet both of those conditions. Press your left leg firmly into the floor, right through the center of the heel. And so this is a dynamic movement, which is going to start with a big inhale. And as you exhale, begin to straighten your right leg by kicking the heel up towards the ceiling. If your knee can't get all the way straight, just stop before things start to hurt. And on the very next inhale, again, bend the knee, come back to the starting position. And exhale, re-straighten the knee and try to kick your heel up a little bit more acutely, a little bit higher. Inhale, knee bends. Exhale, knee straightens. Right? So you got the hang of that. So let's do that about another 6, 7 times for a good total of 10. And every inhale that your knee bends, make it a point to fill up your abdomen and your ribs as we did in the initial breathing of the practice. And every exhale, make it a point to take your exhale flow all the way to the bottom. So there's literally nothing more left to exhale when you get there. And a nerve glide, technically referred to as a neural mobilization, is just a very, very palliative. It's a medical technique, actually. It's a physical therapy technique that allows you to start to remove any adhesions, any stickiness, any association between your muscular tissue and your nerves, basically. And the reason that that's important is because of something called scar tissue. And whether it's from trauma or from just improper movement, injuries, even bruises that you can get on your legs, scar tissue is laid down in an unorganized network. It's kind of like a lattice. And what happens with that oftentimes is the scar tissue also implicates your nerves. So when you then afterwards try to either use the muscle where that scar tissue is by stretching it or putting action to it, strengthening it, contracting it, it will pull on the nerves because the whole thing, it's kind of like an internal scab. And so your nerves that might be stuck or adhere to the scar tissue, they begin to get yanked on when you start to use that muscle. And so then you get nerve symptoms, which can be very delusive because then it's hard to understand whether the nerve sensation is coming from something in your spine or something deep in a joint, or whether it's just, again, like a adhesion in your muscles. And so these nerve glides, they help to comb out the fibers of your muscles so that the nerves can then slide freely between them. Okay, and then let's switch sides. So with your right leg down, pick up your left leg, and the same exact setup. Make sure that your thigh is vertical. Take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, start to straighten your left leg. Good. And just keep going like that on your own, about another 9 times. And so that's where the word or the term, the name, nerve floss comes from. These are all interchangeable. Nerve floss, nerve glide, neural mobilization. And nerve floss really can help to draw this picture with a little bit more clarity that, like floss, your nerves should be able to glide freely within the muscle tissue. And if they don't, that's when trouble occurs. So by slowly engaging, stretching, and then disengaging and relaxing these muscles, you start to separate the nerves from the muscle because you're starting to clean up the scar tissue. Good. And for the rest of the practice, I always want to make sure to state this in the beginning. Make sure that if any of the stretches that we do, any of the mobility movements that we do, take you beyond a level 7 of intensity on a scale of 1 to 10, that you stop and back up to where you're at a 7 at the highest, at the most intense. And the reason for that is because if you make the stretching too intense on the body, your nervous system will begin to fight you because it's going to really feel attacked as if it's in danger. And it's actually going to start to reduce the progress that you're attempting to gain. Good. And now release your left foot. Place both hands flat on the floor. And then place your hands actually underneath your glutes so that the palms are facing down. And then lift both legs up. So this time you have both legs in the same shape, same location as you had the individual legs before. At this point, squeeze your thighs together. Keep your shins parallel to the ground or lower. And we're going to repeat the same thing now. Instead of using your arms to hold the legs, you only have recourse to your abdominal muscles, your core, holding the legs. So this gives us an opportunity to use the core to start to define and initiate that while using the legs. So start with an inhale, not changing anything about your legs. And as you exhale, slowly begin to straighten your knees, kick the heels up at the very end. Inhale, knees bend. Exhale, knees straighten. And you'll notice, of course, that at the very end, towards the last little bit of your leg straightening, you really have to use your abdominal muscles to make sure the thighs and legs stay vertical, which is a great idea because then you place a dynamic movement like this, a continuous movement of straightening and bending your knees, and you're training your core how to stabilize a movement. So one of the best gifts of this practice isn't just knowing and learning how to stabilize the body in a static position, but it's actually training the body how to be stable while change is constantly occurring. And that's in fact what the definition of stability is, right? It's something like the maintenance of action in the presence of change, the maintenance of competence in the presence of change. Let's do just one more of these. Inhale, bend the knees. Exhale, straighten all the way out. Good. And then knees bend again. Let's go back into another part of the nerve glide. So when you pick up your right leg, here's the next part that we're going to do. I want you to externally rotate your leg while keeping the knee bent. So what you're looking at when you look at your leg is your heel and foot is going to be closer to the left leg and left side of the body, and your thigh is going to be pointing to the right, right? So external rotation. You still hold at the same part of the leg. And now we're going to keep that external rotation in the leg and the hip, but still do the same thing that we did in the first one. So you inhale and then exhale as your knee straightens. Your kneecap and your toes are going to be pointing to the right. Inhale, knee bends. Exhale, knee straightens. And in order to maintain that rotation, use your hands a little bit differently so you're constantly encouraging the thigh to rotate out. Good. Let's do maybe 5 more of these. Remember, every inhale, make it a point to fill your belly up maximum. And every exhale, complete the exhale precisely. By externally rotating your leg, you're placing more emphasis on the lateral part of your hamstrings. You know, you have 3 hamstrings. You have 2 on the medial edge of the back thigh and 1 on the lateral edge. And the lateral edge part of the hamstring is called the biceps femoris. And so when you externally rotate your leg, you're putting a little bit more attention into creating flexibility in that lateral biceps femoris part of your hamstring. One more breath out. Good. And then bend your knee, place your foot flat on the mat, pick up your left leg, extend your right leg to the floor, and then use your hands and help to rotate your left leg externally. Again, the left heel is lined up over the right side of the body somewhere. Start with a giant inhalation. And as you exhale, straighten the knee. Make sure that you point your toes and knee as far to the left as you can. Inhale. Exhale, slowly extend. And start to pay attention to what the difference is between having this externally rotated nerve glide position versus the neutral that you had before. And even how does this compare side to side? Was it easier to do the previous side with the externally rotated leg, or is this side easier? And was it easier to do the neutral position that we started with, or is it easier to do this with the external rotation? All these differences point to where you've built up good habits and where you have not. And so if you notice that one side of doing this nerve glide is easier than another, that in itself suggests where most of your efforts should be placed in order to balance out the amount of tension or ease through all three of your hamstrings. Let's do last two here. One of the main answers to managing low back pain is creating flexibility in the hips. Okay, good. Let's go one more time on the right leg. So you had external rotation before. Now when you hold your thigh, now you're going to go into internal rotation. So your thigh and your knee still being vertical, turn your leg out so that your foot is now off the right side of the mat, right? And maybe you can see this somewhat when you're looking at the screen, but basically you rotate your leg out, and instead of your foot being lined up over the left side of the body, it's off to the right, where there is no body. So when you exhale, as you straighten the knee, your toes and kneecap are going to be facing kind of like towards your left shoulder. Inhale, knee bends. Exhale, knee straightens. There we are. And so as we go through maybe another 5 or 6 of these, pay attention to how this compares to the previous 2 rotations of your leg doing the nerve glide. And by now internally rotating your legs, now we put more emphasis on the medial parts of your hamstrings, the semitendinosus and the semimembranosus. Knowing where the hamstrings are more restricted, specifically where they're more restricted, again, gives you a much better pathway to clearing up those restrictions. So instead of doing maybe the same old hamstring stretch over and over again and not seeing the kind of results that you might see in others or that you might be expecting, if you start to isolate now where the hamstrings are a little bit more restricted, those results can actually come through a little bit more directly, a little bit more, let's say, even quickly, even though, of course, we're not racing. Last one, when you straighten your leg, really give it a good kick out through the heel, and then bend the knee, return the foot to the floor, pick up your left leg. Once you've gotten your left leg, extend your right leg to the ground, and same thing, internally rotate your leg. Use your hands to help out. So your foot is going to be off to the left, and you might already see a difference that one leg has a better ability to internally rotate than the other. So notice that. Take notes. Take a deep breath in first. Exhale as your knee straightens, your toes and knee are facing to the right shoulder, or they're on the same plane as the right shoulder, so to speak. Every exhale, when you straighten your knee, give a good kick out through the heel. Inhale, knee bends, fill up your abdomen, fill up your chest. And as you exhale, there's a lot to keep track of, right? You have to keep track of the volume of your breath, the completeness of your breath, while also constantly assessing and reassessing how each time you straighten your leg, how that seems to develop. Last 2 or 3. And if your hands seem to be getting a little bit fatigued at this point, you only have 1 more to go, but it's actually good to fatigue the hands and fingers because they help to strengthen and stabilize your shoulders. Good. Bend the knee, foot flat. Now, you're going to take your arms out to the sides. Make sure your palms are facing down, kind of like warrior 2 arms, but palms into the floor. And you're going to do just the slightest little bit of lift in your pelvis. And when you do that, move your pelvis to the right about 5 or 6 inches. Lift your legs up and then cross your shins and press continuously the outer edges of your feet against each other. Now, holding your legs up like this, connect to your left arm and see if you can press your left shoulder blade, which is basically the back of your left shoulder, into the ground. And there's a sequence, right? There's a little bit of a prioritization. So left shoulder blade presses first, then left elbow, and finally left hand. But if the previous 2 weren't available, don't worry about the hand yet. So you're going to inhale, turn your legs to the left, maybe 50% of the rotation, maybe further, so you can go all the way to the floor. And as you exhale, pressing down with the left arm, you're going to turn back to center. Inhale, turn your thighs and hips over to the left. Exhale, come back to center. And so what you want to feel is that your pelvis is actually rotating. I know I said the hips, but it's really the pelvis. The hips aren't rotating at all. And so every time you inhale, move your knees to the left, you should be legitimately rolling over onto the left side of your pelvis or your left hip. And when you exhale, come on back to center. You want to make sure the whole back of the pelvis is flattened on the ground again. And we'll do this 4 more times. Now, the reason for this movement is not only do we get some good spinal rotation with it, but you're helping to reinstate the function of your abdominal chain called the obliques. The obliques are your direct and main spine twisting muscles, and they're also your forced exhalation muscles. So when you get to strengthen those, you get to strengthen both the exhale process and twisting. Last breath out as you lift your legs all the way up. Then place your feet flat on the floor. Lift your pelvis up, bring it back to center, and then lift it and move it off to the left. If there's anything off to the right side of the body, move it out of the way. And then when you lift your knees this time, keep your knees bent, cross with the other foot on top. So you kind of break any habits that might be there. From here, press the right shoulder blade, right elbow, and right hand into the ground. And then inhale, roll your legs over to the right. So you go to the right of the pelvis and hip. Exhale, pressing the right arm down, bring your knees to center. Inhale, so 50% rotation, or if you like, you can go all the way until your thigh touches the ground. Exhale, lift up. 5 more times. Inhale. And as soon as you initiate that exhale, start to really dig the right shoulder blade, the back of the right shoulder to the ground. Keep going. Big inhale. Exhale, come back to center. And last 2 or 3. If you're starting to get fatigued, I want you to think about welcoming that. It's all how you frame it. Therapeutic yoga doesn't mean just easy laying around inactive yoga. Therapeutic is very compatible with strength training and dynamic development. The only difference really is that it's specific to one's own needs. And on the last one, when your knees come back up, set your feet down, move your pelvis back to center, and then let's roll over to the side and then come up onto your knees and set yourself up for child's pose. You can move your head blanket out of the way. Make sure that your thighs are well separated so you have some space for your abdomen. And you can place your hands out in front of you, forehead on the mat. Let your hips sink into the heels. Okay, so now from there, generating just a little bit more effort, lift your elbows off the floor, only as long as you can keep your head on the ground. If you can keep the weight of your head on the ground, on the forehead. So when your elbows lift, and by the way, if you can't do that, you can just relax the elbows, keep them on the floor. But if your elbows are lifted, keeping the head down, press forward with your hands almost as if you were doing dog pose in order to drive your sitting bones and hips to the heels. So you're using your arms to distance yourself from your hands. Okay, now we're going to do a Parsva Balasana, so just a side flexion on top of child's pose. If your knees are too wide, remember, at the very most, you're going to have your mid-thighs, somewhere around the mid-thighs, just be bracing the outer rib cage. But there is a point of diminishing returns if you widen your legs too much. So
There is such a thing as too narrow and too wide. You want to find that perfect center. And then we're going to walk our arms, over to the right. And once you get your arms over to the right, make sure that you still keep projecting your hands further and further away from you. Your right arm is going to be more relevant here, so I want you to, everybody, keep the elbows straight. At the very most, your sternum is going to be positioned right over your right thigh, so you can even lay the weight of your torso down on the leg. Now, with the right arm, you're going to push away with the hand. You're going to push away with the arm and the shoulder muscles and try to pin down the left sitting bone. So there's a relationship going across the midline of the body where you push away with the right arm, but you're establishing more depth in the left sit bone. And the left hand just simply holds onto the floor. There's really nothing active for it to do other than just not be pushed out of its position. And even though we're creating a slight side bend, and remember, it has to be slight, don't overdo it, you still want to make sure that you're importing more length. So that means your hands have to strive to be further and further from the body so as to keep creating space in your spinal column, right? Very similar to what I said earlier about axial extension, about relieving pressure of the discs so that your spine can work better. And the awesome thing about relieving pressure off the discs, because the discs are so what's called hydrophilic, they have an affinity for water, when you relieve pressure off of them, they have a tendency to soak moisture back up, to soak water back up and get rehydrated. Because, of course, the function and health of our spinal discs relies explicitly on how hydrated they are, how squishy and supple they are. Good. Next inhale, start to walk your hands over to the left, back to center, and then continue walking your hands over to the left. At the very most, you're going to have the center of your chest at the sternum on top of your left thigh. And now your left arm is going to have to do more of this job. So you're going to press away with the left arm and connect that to pushing down, nailing your right sitting bone to your right heel. Your right hand just holds on. Your left hand is pushing, your right hand is holding on. And you want to actually derive a feeling kind of like you're pulling with the right arm, or your right arm is being pulled away from the body, thereby accentuating the opening and the bend that you have on the right side of the ribs. Keep your jaw relaxed. Keep your eyes relaxed and closed as much as comfortable. 2 more breaths. Yeah, let your head rest on your knee or your thigh somewhere. If your head can make it to the mat, if you have a long torso comparatively to your legs, then that's fine. Otherwise, chin on the knee. Last breath out. Lovely. And then walking your hands back to center. You're going to sit back up by walking your hands towards the hips. Okay. And then come forward on all fours. Get your hands set up for downward dog. Make sure that your hands, your wrists specifically, are never ever wider than shoulders width. Keep your fingers spread and then come into this kind of downward dog first. So keep the knees bent and just push away with your arms and try to stick your butt out behind you. And you can bend your knees as much as possible, but I want you to feel as if you're aiming your sitting bones to the top back corner of your practice space right now, the top back corner of the ceiling behind you. And so what you have here is a blend of a squat, a malasana, with downward dog, which is very healthy for the low back. Now, I want you to note specifically how your sit bones feel and how exposed they can feel when you bend your knees. So we're going to just do this 3 times. So when you exhale and straighten your knees, try to keep that amount of sit bone exposure as your knees straighten and you start to reach the heels down to the floor. Inhale, knees bend. Stick your sit bones out. Keep your sit bones sticking out as you re-straighten your legs and try to repin the heels. Inhale, bend the knees. Exhale, straighten. Keep your sitting bones sticking out. Good. And then bring your right foot forward between the hands and your left knee down for just a low lunge. Make sure that your right foot and right leg is in line with the right hip and your left leg is in line with the left. That means you're not on the single narrow track right in the middle with both legs. Once you get the back knee down, engage your glute and lift your torso up. Right, so this is just a very simple low lunge. Reach your arms overhead. Make sure that your palms are flat together. And look up towards the fingers. Start to reach your entire shoulder girdle up. And so if you do that correctly, and it might take a little time to develop it, you'll actually feel how your whole shoulder girdle comes up and cradles your head from below, which is actually very good for the neck. And if it hurts to lift your head and look up, just notice if you're overarching your neck, right? So just by lifting the chin instead of throwing the chin back behind you, you get that decompression in your cervical spine. Keep your left glute engaged. Let's take 2 more cycles. Next exhale, hands come down, and then switch sides. Right knee on the mat, make sure the left leg and the right leg are on their own separate tracks. Once you come upright, make sure your right glute's engaged because your right glute is the opposite muscle, the antagonist muscle to your hip flexors, which are oftentimes very constricted and chronically tight when people have low back pain. So you get your arms up, and same thing, make sure your fingers are not interlaced. Squeeze your palms together and start to elevate your shoulder blades. And you don't have to arch your back. Right now, we're just interested more in lengthening. And one thing that'll help you from arching your back too much is exactly that engagement of your right glute. 2 more breaths. Every inhale, distance your hands further from the head. Every exhale, keep that distance. 1 more time. And on the next exhale, hands come down. Switch legs again. Step your right foot forward. Okay, this time, lift your back knee. Keep your left hand on the mat. Start with your right hand on your right thigh. Pressing away with both arms. Begin to turn your head over your right shoulder. And if you feel so inclined, extend your right arm up too. But if that feels like a little bit too much, or you feel anything in the shoulder that's a little bit unsavory, just return your hand back to the thigh. Make sure your fingers on the right hand are facing in towards your chest. But the biggest impact of this pose, of any lunge, in fact, is how you establish the actions of the back leg. So you keep your back knee utterly straight and your left glutes utterly tight and contracted in order to continue undermining that chronic strain in the psoas. Last breath out. And then inhale, knee down, hands down, switch sides. Lift your back knee up. With your right hand, before you do anything with the left hand, make sure that your middle finger on that right hand is facing straight ahead, and the left hand on the left thigh to start, fingers facing your body. And then start to turn your head and look over your left shoulder. And that way you set the mark and the target of where you want your twist to be with your head rotation first, which doesn't necessarily mean your eyes. It's just the rotation of the head. And as before, you can lift your back left arm up or not, as long as it doesn't force you or compel you to evade the articulation of that back leg. So those 2 important skills of straightening the knee and keeping the right butt active. Last 2 breaths. Good. Inhale, bring your right knee down, bring the left hand down.
Okay, now I'm going to go somewhere a little bit different, but same. With your hands on the mat, switching legs, right leg forward, left knee down. Get yourself into a low lunge, and then get a block or two ready. So first thing, when your hands are on the mat, adjust my shorts here, excuse me, you have to be able to get your back knee as far away from this front foot as you can. And what that means is you can, to a certain extent, take your front knee back behind your ankle on the front leg. But I want you to use more of the back leg extension skill to go back further away from the front leg so that your pelvis sits closer to the mat, right? The further your legs are from each other, the closer you're to the ground. And that's when you grab your block and you put your block just right this in this tower setting. You put that underneath your right sitting bone. Make sure it's actually on that bone. And notice if you're stable before going on. And once you are stable, start to walk your hands up on your front thigh, and you end up in this vertical, or at least aiming towards this vertical position. Now, as I've shown before, if one block isn't enough, create this upside down letter T position. And you put that underneath your sit bone. But once you're upright, two things that help to encourage more low back strength and actually low back flexibility, low back health. I already mentioned one, that's your glute power. So keep the left glute engaged, which is 1/2 of what's necessary to rotate your pelvis posteriorly, which is the opposite of what you do when you stick your butt out. The second half of that is the elevation of your low belly muscle. And so that initiates from the pelvic floor, but it specifically should capture your transversus abdominis muscle. And so the way that you lift that up starts to kind of amplify how the rest of your spine sits. And you might even notice in the way that your chest feels once you've lifted the lower belly. But you can keep your hands on the front leg and then just settle down into the lunge, settle your weight down into the block underneath your right sit bone, keep your left glute engaged, and just spending a little bit of time here because the psoas muscle is not an easy one to create any changes in, especially if it's changes of length and flexibility. And a lot of more modern, more recent research has shown that it seems that stretching times are somewhat symmetrical to somebody's age. And so before, there was a school of thought that said 30 seconds is sufficient for a stretch, even 20 to 30 seconds. And after that, it doesn't really do anything different. And then they show that, oh, wait, it's actually a minute. A minute creates good results. So no less than a minute. And then later on, they found out that actually, the older you get, the more time you need within a stretch, within a muscle. And so now it's at a place where the amount of years that a person is should be roughly equivalent to the amount of seconds that they need in a stretching position. Okay, I think it's been about a good minute, so let's bring the hands down. Take the block from underneath your right sit bone, bring your right leg back, step your left leg forward, and again, start to lengthen the back knee away from the front foot. And then place the block or blocks underneath your left sit bone, and then come upright. And I didn't say it on the previous side, I apologize, but whether your back toes are pointing like mine are, or they're curled, doesn't matter. The only thing is if you're going to point your back toes, make sure you just exercise a little bit of kind of clipping the ground with your back toes. So it's a very similar, well, in fact, it's the same thing as lifting the toes on the front foot, but if your foot's upside down, the toes end up pressing into the mat. So both hands on the front thigh, engage your right butt, and then lift the lower belly. Lift the lower belly from the inside. Like I said already, that's initiated from deep, deep in your pelvic floor. And those are all of our familiar number 1 and number 2 muscles. So if you start to engage those, it gives you a little clear path on how to lift the low belly. And as you sit in this pose, if you'd like to close your eyes, if you're comfortable enough with it, it's actually going to open up a little bit more detailed awareness of what's happening. Using the low belly lift, using the right glute engagement, try to effect more of that posterior tilt. So within this pose, use those 2 actions to pull your butt into the body, to do the opposite of sticking it out behind you. Relax the jaw, relax your palate, relax your forehead. And this is a technique that I've taught for years, and when I was instructed in it, it really even made a difference in my practice. It made a difference in the progress that I was able to develop with clients in their own specific health goals. And you can see that it's not the most complicated thing to set up. Once you get the basic idea of it, it's fairly straightforward. And so it's good to use this pose, especially if you have low back tension, psoas tension. It doesn't take much time, as you can tell. You could do this once a day. 5 minutes, 10 minutes would be difficult to do this pose on, but just do 1 to 3 sets, about a minute on each side. These last 2 breaths, just make sure that your jaw and your throat tension have not been resurrected unbeknownst to you. And then start to bring your hands to the mat. Yes, bring your left leg back and then lay down on your abdomen. And so what we've done right now is just prepared the ground being the body, prepare the body for a little bit more of a back bending skill. So when you set yourself up for this cobra, keep your hands in line with the shoulders, but not necessarily right below them. So in line can be wider, but again, don't go too wide. I just don't want you to feel confined in the torso. Keep the elbows in the upper arms, not squeezing into the ribs. If they're in contact, that's fine, but don't actively squeeze your torso with your arms. Engage your fingertips, especially on the middle and index fingers. Dig those into the ground and try to see how the squeezing of the fingertips into the mat help you deepen the knuckles of those fingers into the mat. And when you do that, lift your wrists up. So we kind of got to exaggerate a little bit. When you lift your wrists up, you place all of the onus, all of the action into muscles instead of just landing on joints, which is a healthier way to do it. And when you bring your wrists back down, try not to ever let most of your weight pressure that's going into the hands land on the wrists. Keep it more in the knuckles and those fingertips. Point your toes, clip the toenails into the mat, engage your butt, keeping the feet on the ground, lift your knees, keeping your butt engaged. Now start to pull forward with the arms, right? So you're pulling the hands back, which in turn pulls the chest forward. And when you feel that happening, then start to add to it, as long as you're still pulling, by pushing your chest up towards the ceiling. So what you're doing effectively with the hands is initially you're pulling them back, and then you're pushing them into the ground. And try to connect that to the way that your shoulders sit on your torso. So your shoulders are moving back away from the chest and down away from the ears. Back away from the chest and down away from the ears. And if you start to get your elbows straighter and straighter, if eventually your elbows come to be fully straight, make sure that your pubic bone is in contact with the mat. Keep your glutes tight, relax your mouth. 2 more breaths only. Now on the next exhale, slowly start to come on down.
And just place one hand or one forearm on top of the other and place your head on that. Make sure that your toes are turned in, your heels are turned out. Okay, so being that this is a lower back targeted class, I want to give you something different for Shavasana, which is basically called a downward facing Shavasana. So get your blanket or towels out right now, and you're going to be in the same pose, except your head is going to be on the blanket or blankets. I want you to try to feel whether or not doing that, supporting your head, feels that your neck is in line with the spine. So you just want to make sure that they are, of course, that the spine is in line with the neck, because the neck is the spine as well. And as far as where the support of your head goes and what part of your face it should touch, try to actually let the blanket cover up like the top half of your face to where your eyes and your eye sockets are flattened down against the blanket. So only thing that doesn't get pushed on is the tip of the nose and the mouth. But placing your head straight down like this, feel how long the back of the neck is. So if you need to lift your head and just kind of tuck the chin as you place the head on the blanket, you might notice that that has a better response. And when you go through that adjustment where you tuck your chin before placing the head down, you might notice that the blanket, in a way, pushes the skin of your forehead and your eyelids down towards the tip of the nose, which is exactly right, which is what you want. And it's okay to feel the pressure from your head weight on the eyeballs themselves. Your hands can either be right next to your head, kind of in a diamond position next to your torso, next to your head, or they can be right at the sides. Whatever feels the most comfortable. Your legs, keep your toes turned in, keep your knees turned in towards each other, heels facing out. So your hips are internally rotated. And downward facing Shavasana like this is really one of the greatest things for the lower back, because it allows you to internally rotate your legs, keep them in that position passively, which starts to create more room, more fluidity, you can say, in the pelvis, the SI joints, which in themselves, as soon as they get into better shape, into better functional ability, they assuage any excess tension placed on the low back. And enjoy the Shavasana for really however much time you have, whether it's just a minute or the next 5 or 10. Let yourself completely become immersed in the field of gravity. Give yourself permission to be utterly heavy, weighty. And whenever you feel like your Shavasana has come to an end, then you can just press back to child's pose. But that is it for our practice today. Thank you for joining me. Make sure that you always hydrate after you practice, because hydration is a huge subset of musculoskeletal health. And I will see you soon. Much love. Namaste.